On the evening of Sunday, the 14th of April 1912, the RMS Titanic was steadily making its way across the Atlantic Ocean towards America and New York City from Southampton in England. The maiden journey had been largely uneventful. Passengers of all classes enjoyed the grandeur and luxury of the largest ship afloat at the time, and in today's episode I shall be talking about the events that led up to the sinking of the Titanic. The weather was unusually calm on the 14th of April, and Titanic received messages from other ships in the area warning her of packs of ice as well as large icebergs. Some of these messages, however, were never passed on to the ship's captain, Captain Smith, or the bridge officers by the Marconi wireless operators, mainly because they were relaying messages for the ship's passengers. The men had become swamped with messages due to the system breaking the day before. The men were also not members of the ship's company. They were employees of the Marconi company, meaning that their primary responsibility was to the passengers. Other messages became of secondary importance, even ones as important as ice warnings. As the evening of the 14th of April neared its end, most of the ship's passengers were in their cabins asleep. Command of the bridge was passed from Second Officer Charles Lightoller to First Officer William Murdoch. In the crow's nest above the deck, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee looked out into the darkness. The air was cold and the sea was incredibly calm. This made their job of seeing icebergs much harder. Waves breaking against the icebergs would potentially make them more visible. At approximately 23:40, an iceberg was spotted. Frederick Fleet leaps into action and he rings the ship's bell, phones down to the bridge and informs them that an iceberg is dead ahead. First Officer Murdoch, upon hearing the news, orders the ship hard a starboard, the engines to full reverse and all watertight doors locked. But it was too late, and despite the crew's best efforts, Titanic doesn't turn in time, and instead of hitting the iceberg head on, which potentially may have saved her, she strikes the iceberg with a glancing but deadly blow on the starboard side. Chunks of ice hit the deck, and after less than 10 seconds, Titanic passes the iceberg. She finally comes to a dead stop in the Atlantic. Captain Smith and other officers raced to the bridge and began to assess the damage, along with the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews. They head below decks and find the crew desperately battling to pump out water. Titanic was built with 16 watertight compartments, which were separated by bulkheads. The bulkheads, however, did not go to the top of the compartment, meaning that water, in theory, would spill over into the next compartment should they be breached. It's believed that if 4 of these compartments were flooded with water, Titanic could still realistically float and remain buoyant. Upon inspection, it was revealed that the iceberg had ripped several holes in the hull below the waterline, and crucially, it had breached 5 watertight compartments. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, informed Captain Smith that in approximately 2 hours, despite their best efforts, Titanic would be at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. At midnight, Smith ordered the radio operators to begin sending distress calls in hope that a nearby ship would come to their aid. He also gave orders that the passengers be mustered on deck and the lifeboats be uncovered. Titanic had 20 lifeboats. These lifeboats had room for around half of the ship's passengers. And yes, while this sounds ridiculous today, this was actually within the legal requirements for lifeboats at the time of the disaster. Lifeboats were simply intended to be used to ferry passengers from the stricken vessel to a rescue ship. They were never designed to hold passengers at sea. The ship's officers began loading their lifeboats with passengers. The order from Captain Smith was that women and children should be loaded first, as this was standard protocol of the time. Problems began to show early though. The crew had practiced very little in loading the boats, or drilling with them at all. In fact, since leaving Southampton, not one lifeboat drill had taken place, and the only one scheduled had been cancelled earlier that day. Lifeboat 7, which departed the Titanic first, left with only around 27 people aboard, despite having room for 65. When orders were given to load the lifeboats, Charles Lightoller was ordered to oversee the lifeboats on the port side, and William Murdoch was ordered to do so on the starboard side. A problem began to arise. Both men interpreted the women and children order first differently. Murdoch took the order to mean women and children first, and allowed men a seat in the lifeboats if no women or children were present. Lightoller, on the other hand, took it as women and children only, and refused men a seat regardless, and many of his lifeboats left with empty seats. The Titanic's distress messages finally reached the RMS Carpathia. She immediately set course for Titanic, but she was 58 miles away, and being much slower than Titanic, informed the Marconi operators that she would be there in 4 hours. As time passed, it became clear to the passengers and crew that Titanic was sinking, and by 1 a.m, the ship began to sink below the waterline. Husbands begged their wives to get into the lifeboats. Fathers hugged their children and assured them that they would be okay and not to worry. Many heartbreaking moments were unfolding throughout the ship, as many people realised that they wouldn't make it through the night alive. As time moved on, the remaining lifeboats were filled much closer to their capacity, but it began to dawn on many passengers that they were running out of time. People began to panic and rush the boats, and the ship's fifth officer, Howard Lowe, was forced to fire a pistol in the air in an effort to control the crowd. Most passengers, however, accepted their fate and quietly waited for the inevitable. At 2:05 a.m, the last lifeboat left Titanic. Captain Smith toured the ship and relieved the radio operators of their duty, reportedly telling the crew, "Now, it's every man for himself." Several stories circulated about what Captain Smith did after this. What is clear, though, is that he perished in the sinking, as did Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, who was reportedly seen throwing chairs into the ocean for passengers to cling onto before he retired to the smoking room. Neither man was seen again. 1,500 people remained on the ship, and Titanic began to rise out of the water. A great noise was heard, and the ship's lights flickered before shutting off completely, plunging everything into darkness. The stern eventually snapped under the intense weight and pressure, and the front half of the ship disappeared. Eventually, the stern also began to fill with water and sank as well. The night was now filled with the screams and howls of the people floating in the freezing ocean. The water was lethal, and Second Officer Charles Lightoller described the feeling like 1,000 knives being driven into his body. Those people in the lifeboats a few hundred yards away sat in shock. The sailors that manned them nervous to head back for fear of being swamped by those in the water. Eventually, a lifeboat did go back and pulled 4 survivors out. At around 4 a.m, the Carpathia arrived on the scene and began picking up the passengers in the lifeboats. Only around 700 passengers survived the sinking of the Titanic, with over 1,500 losing their lives. The Carpathia made its way to New York and arrived on the 18th of April. Most of the bodies of Titanic's passengers were never recovered, despite efforts to do so. The wreck of the ship was eventually rediscovered in 1985, and hundreds of pieces of debris lie at the bottom of the ocean, each one telling a different story. The wreck itself is slowly deteriorating due to bacteria, and scientists believe that by 2040, the structure will collapse and Titanic will be gone forever. The ship is probably one of the most famous in history, and several books and films have been written and made about the event, most famously in 1997 with the James Cameron epic Titanic. The film, for the most part, is a historically decent portrayal. It did receive criticism for its portrayals of certain people, especially William Murdoch and Bruce Ismay. While the ship itself will eventually disappear, several museums are dedicated to keeping the legacy of the ship alive on both sides of the Atlantic. That concludes today's episode. Hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you all for watching, and if you do enjoy my content, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. See you all on the next one. Bye bye.